So I wanted to ask you about the origins of the film. It sounds like it was just, in a sense, kind of your instinct to film. Many documentaries, the filmmakers don't really have a way of knowing, the direction it may go. In this case, you didn't even necessarily have a documentary in mind initially.
Yeah, you're right. I had no intention of making a documentary when I first started filming this. When I moved back home from New York, I had all this free time on my hands, and prior to the pandemic, I always knew I wanted to share my family's story. I mean, if you think about what my parents, a Mexican American woman and this Cambodian refugee, what they were able to achieve in, of all places, Bad Axe, Michigan, it's the American dream. So I always thought I would write a script, and that would be my way of sharing that story. So I sat down in those early days of the pandemic doing two things, and one of them was just getting this whole oral history of how the restaurant came to be what it is today. Thinking this was just research to write a script one day. So just hearing how the restaurant came to be, not only a success but also a pinnacle of what Bad Axe Michigan is. But the other part is that instinct, right? It was, and I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily know what that instinct was, other than knowing it was an important time in our lives, and knowing I wanted to just capture that on camera. For I think the reason being just having these memories and home videos to hold on to. But when I realized I had a documentary, it was that I wanted to make a documentary. I think it was shortly after the Black Lives Matter movement happened. When I began to see these parallel between these two things of this history of this American dream I just had on camera in these early days, but also that our family was still fighting so hard to keep that alive in 2020 in the face of a pandemic and the racial reckoning and everything that was a politically divided nation. I mean, it was this is the way to tell this story of the American dream was a documentary, and that's just the way it just naturally unfolded.
Yeah, the way everything collided, I think, just opens a window onto the entire country, not simply a small town in Michigan. I'm curious what it was like for you growing up in Bad Axe, because as I think we see in the film, and for anyone who follows the news or social media, clearly the country is far more polarized maybe than it ever has been. So things are getting worse in that respect. But what was it like as a kid in that town?
I mean, life growing up in Bad Axe, when I look back on it, I am very grateful for the childhood I had growing up and the upbringing I had, because Bad Axe is it's like my brother-in-law says, it's such a tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone, and people do take care of each other there. Having said that, just like any small town in anywhere in the U.S., it has its problems, especially when it comes to racism. So yeah, I experience racism more often than anyone should growing up. Being called Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, and even being called the N-word because my skin is a darker color. Those were all things I experienced growing up, and I always felt embarrassed or ashamed of that, which it took moving away from Bad Axe and gaining that perspective of, I guess going to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and living in LA and living in New York, knowing that why am I embarrassed of that? I'm actually the one that's not the problem here. It's the way of thinking that some of these individuals have in this community that needs to open up and needs to change. But that's what it came with growing up in Bad Axe, and those experiences. I say it's a love letter to Bad Axe because it really is. That love is unconditional, because it's what made me who I am today, and it's what made our family who we are today. You take the good with the bad with that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter protests, which is such an extraordinary scene and very upsetting, I think, for the audience to watch. Let alone for you to be there in the midst of it. But whether it was that scene or others, what was the hardest parts of making the film? Was it those kind of moments, or seeing your father be so vulnerable at times on camera, which is probably a little, I don't know if scary is the word for a son to see that, but
Yeah, it was, God, it was kind of all of it. I mean, you know, speaking on my dad first, I mean, he always shared his stories about surviving the killing fields growing up. But what he didn't ever really share was how those stories affected who he is as a dad, as the person who he is today. It really took those hour-long conversations of having the camera pointed at him for him to really open up about that. And I don't know if that was more hard for me, as more I was just thankful, actually really grateful he was willing to share those emotions he never did before with me, because during the pandemic he had all this free time on his hands, just like we all did, right? And it gave him a lot of time to think. And yes, he's a storyteller, but like I said, like it's one thing to tell these stories, it's another thing to talk about like how they actually have affected who you are and the trauma that comes with that. So I was grateful he was willing to open up about that stuff. But I think, like if we're talking about like the more difficult sides of making this film, it really came along in the editing process. It's easy for me to pick up a camera and film these moments. It truly is, because that's what I've just kind of done my whole life. It's another thing to take those moments and start editing together to tell a story. And especially when that story is about your family, because, as you've seen, my family is very opinionated. No. So everybody had their own ideas about what the film should be. And
you had some co-directors.
I had a lot of co-directors. But I'll say that, like in those early editing days, I think I kind of lost track of why I was doing this film in the first place, and wanted to be this filmmaker that stood up on my soapbox and pointed out everything that was wrong with our country, just yelling into the echo chambers. And my family was the one that's like, you're not going to change people's, you're not going to open up people's hearts by doing that. Like, why are you even doing this in the first place? And it really took those tough conversations with them to come to the answer to that, which was actually quite simple, which was the love I had for my family and wanting to share their story of resilience. And coming back to the answer of love, I think is what the film needed in order for it to, take the final form that it currently has. Because, with this film, I when I came to that conclusion, I realized like I can't preach to people. I don't need to preach to people. I just need to show, and tell this personal story that I wanted to start doing from the first place. And then these like messages and these themes naturally unveil themselves in a way where through an empathetic lens versus, like trying to tell you you're wrong if you disagree. Because the film, at the end of the day, it's not trying to do that. It's just trying to show an experience that might be different from others, growing up in towns like Bad Axe, Michigan.
One of the things that fascinated me about the film, you begin it with that letter that was sent in sort of a happy font style almost. I was like, is that Comic Sans Serif? And only it was, but it sort of belied the tone of it.
Yeah.
But the person saying that, we stand for traditional American values. Yes. Well, what are those values?
Yeah, that's something that really got to me, because like I think in the process of making this film, one of the things I really want audiences to walk away with is looking at my family as being more American than any other family. Because, when people think of the Siev family, my family, they might not think of us as your traditional American family, but the reality is that America is a country that's built on immigrants and refugees. And what my family experienced during the pandemic was what so many other families from not even backgrounds like ours, but from all backgrounds experience, right? And like, so therefore, like, that's the American experience. And, with that, I hope, like, when people view our family, it opens up their idea of what the American family is. So when people, when we got that letter and it's like traditional American values, it's like, what is that? Those are your traditional American values. It's not everyone's, traditional American values. It's like when Jacqueline says, like, Bad X is still our hometown. It's true. It's just as much as my home as it is any of my neighbors' home, and that really played the influence in naming the film Bad X too. Because at first we're like, oh, like, are people going to be turned off that the Siev family, we're the ones making a film called Bad X because we're far different than anyone else in our community. But then I thought about it, I'm like, no, I have every right to make a film called Bad X than anybody else in this town.
Yeah, when I first saw the title, I thought, wow, that's a great name for a horror film.
We get that a lot, but it creates intrigue, which I guess is not a bad thing.
I'm sure there's a story about how the town got named. That may be for another time. But how do you think the film is sort of the process of making it and then bringing it out into the world and going to so many film festivals? Which, by the way, it's won many awards, including your world premiere at South by Southwest, where you won an award and the Audience Award. But how has it sort of changed your family, or do you think it has? I think one of the things documentaries can do of that nature is people get to say things that they just wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, I honestly say that, we were a close family even before making this. And now that the film has been out there and we're on this journey of promoting the film together as a family, it's really only brought us that much closer together. I was telling you this earlier, we're in the middle of a 45-day road trip right now, just across the country promoting the film. And we're so grateful. My parents never got to travel at all prior to this year. Our idea of vacation was driving 3 hours to Toronto and spending 2 days there. And now they've seen every corner of the country in the past month. And we've gotten to just, spend time together and celebrate and share a story and have conversations with other people. It's something that, I'm so grateful for. And to be able to do that together as a family it's just made us that much closer and so much stronger together. I don't take any of it for granted, and I don't think they do either.
Well, it's a tremendous film. I personally, speak for myself, think it's without a doubt one of the finest documentaries of the year, and one that I think is really gonna last, and has touched so many people. I'm sure others in the audience tonight as well. So let's thank David Siev for this beautiful film.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sticking around.